So, welcome everybody to this week's episode of University of Maryland Extension presents the Backyard Gardener slash Farming series. It is my pleasure to have our ag agent in Wacomico County, Dr. Haley Sater, speak today. Today, she's going to talk about caneberries, which is going to be very great. We are going to ask everyone to stay on mute and potentially please keep your cameras off to preserve bandwidth. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. This way, Haley can go through at the very end of the presentation and answer all of them. This, like all of our previous backyard gardening series, is being recorded. So if you do not want your voice or your face recorded, please again, stay on mute, keep your cameras off. And because of that, in the event that you drop, you can go ahead and watch the recording, which will be available on YouTube later on. So just a quick disclaimer that the University of Maryland Extension is a research-based institution. While we as educators enjoy teaching, we must ensure that the information we provide is useful to our clients, which is you guys. We utilize tools such as surveys to evaluate and measure the outcomes of programs such as this one. To help us guide future backyard gardening webinars, we ask you to consider completing a follow-up survey. Following the completion of the whole series, you're going to receive a survey to the email address that you used to register for this webinar. This survey will be used to determine the effectiveness of this webinar and potential future subjects and times for additional webinars. The survey is completely voluntary and does not affect your ability to participate in future University of Maryland Extension programs. All information is confidential. You must be fluent in English and over the age of 18 to participate. Each webinar is scheduled to be about 1 hour in length, and the survey should take you approximately 5 minutes to complete. If you wish to opt out of receiving the survey, you may do so by emailing Haley Sater at hsater@umd.edu. We greatly value your input, and with your feedback, University of Maryland Extension will better be able to provide educational programs and services to meet yours and your community's needs. Thank you in advance for your support. At this point, I would say anyone who potentially needs closed captioning, you are able to equip that down at the bottom of your Zoom link. If you have any troubles with that, please, you can reach out to me directly in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Haley to go ahead and start talking about caneberries.
All right. Thank you, Emily. Like Emily said, I'm Haley Sater. I'm an ag agent, but I work, what my background is in small fruit production, and I work mostly with fruit and vegetable growers. See if it'll move. Okay, so first, I want to define what caneberries are, because I think that sometimes when we say caneberries, or if I say caneberries, people sometimes think I'm talking about blueberries, and sometimes the branches of a blueberry are called the canes, but generally the definition of caneberries are brambles, is another term for them. So blackberries, raspberries, and then black raspberries are another type of caneberry. There are also raspberries with different colors other than red. We'll get into that in a little bit. So why should you be interested in caneberries? Why grow them, and specifically in Maryland? So what I really like about brambles or caneberries is that they are going to produce fruit after only 2 years. And if you keep listening, there are some varieties or types that will bear fruit in the first year. So that's a lot sooner than a lot of other fruits. The other reason I think that they're really great is they're highly productive in that each plant will bear up to, 10 to 20 pounds of fruit per year, depending on how healthy it is and the fertility, and also, some of the genetics like the variety. They are pretty easy to get going and establish in Maryland, especially when you compare caneberries to other types of fruits like apples or peaches. I mean, it's pretty easy to get an apple or a peach planted, but you're going to be waiting years before you get any fruit from it, they are likely going to have a lot of disease. The fruit are usually not going to be very pretty looking after several months in the summer, and all the pests and diseases that we have. So I think caneberries make a lot more sense for most home gardeners. They're more space efficient. You can fit them into smaller yards and spaces. You can grow them even in pots if you want. And then also, small fruits like raspberries and blackberries are some of the healthiest fruits for you. So they're also kind of expensive when you buy them at the store. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to grow your own. Just a little bit of background about blackberries and raspberries before we get into more of the growing tips. Both blackberries and raspberries belong to the Rubus genus. That just means that they're very closely related. They have basically identical life cycles. So they grow as biannuals, which means they each cane has 2 years of growth. But then the actual planting, once you get a plant established, will last for 10 to 20 years. Okay, so um, to kind of define what a biannual cane is and what it means for the life cycle of these plants is in the first year, the new canes that are coming out of the ground that are going to be essentially new shoots or new suckers, uh, they are going to spend their first year just growing, getting bigger. It's in the second year when the cane gets a new name. Oh, sorry. The first year cane is called a primocane because it's the first, so prime. You can remember it that way. And then the second year cane is called a floricane because the second year cane is the one that is going to flower, and then those flowers are what are going to bear fruit. So right now at home, both my blackberries and raspberries have buds on them on the floricanes. And now generally, once you get a planting established, you will have a mix of primocanes that are coming up and new, and floricanes that were growing last year. So you'll have a mix in your planting, like in this picture. So now that I just told you that they only bear fruit on second year canes, there are some varieties of both blackberries and raspberries that will bear fruit. Oh, I think I was supposed to put primocane here. Oops. There are some varieties that have developed a mutation where they can produce fruit the first year, so on the primocanes. These are called the primocane fruiting varieties. Sometimes there's another term used called everbearing. Um, and so when these primocane fruiting varieties make fruit, it's going to be in the fall. So it's going to be later than the normal floricane season because first it takes the plant all spring and summer to grow and get big enough to flower. And then so the fruit are going to come on later in the year. And so if you leave these floricanes that have already, or sorry, primocanes that have already borne a first year of fruit in the fall, they will still produce another round of fruit on the floricanes in the spring. So in some production systems, if you're growing these types that will bear fruit on the primocanes, some people will just mow them down and they only want that fall fruit. Other people will let them grow that second year and make fruit on the floricanes. And usually, if they make a really big crop in the fall, they'll make a smaller crop in the spring on the floricanes. Whereas if they have kind of a bad year in the fall, they'll make a bigger crop on the floricanes. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb. I personally have some primocane fruiting raspberries, and I let them fruit on floricanes just because I like the spring and summer fruit a little bit better than fall fruit. Um, okay, so other reasons why I think blackberries and raspberries are a cool option for people to grow is that they are both native to the US. So both blackberries and raspberries, here are the maps of the areas of the United States in which they are native. Raspberries pretty much are all over the US, other than in the South. They don't really like the heat as much. Whereas blackberries, actually, a lot of the blackberries that we grow are a little bit more cold sensitive, but they're also native to many parts of the US. Now, that said, I would not advise you to go out and dig up a bunch of wild blackberries or raspberries. And the reason for that is because um, sometimes they're harboring diseases, and if you purchase a plant that a named variety of blackberries or raspberries, you're going to get much higher fruit quality. So the fruit usually tastes better. It's usually bigger. It's usually going to be a little bit maybe more firm. So with like better shelf life if you want to put it in the fridge and have it not fall apart on you. And then the big thing for me, especially with blackberries, is the thornlessness. I am not going to mess around with a thorny blackberry because they have some really gruesome, sharp thorns on them. So I would recommend that you purchase your plants or, I mean, get them from a friend, but make sure you know what kind of variety they are. I wouldn't just dig them up out of the woods. Other requirements or things to know before you plant blackberries or raspberries. Wherever you plant them, you're going to want to make sure that you have loose worked soil. You're going to want to plant them in the spring. So actually planting now would be a little bit late. You could probably get away with it as long as you did a good job keeping them watered. But generally you want to plant a little bit earlier in March, or you can plant the fall in October, when most of the summer heat is gone. And then irrigation, I say irrigation is a must in Maryland. That doesn't mean you have to set up a whole fancy irrigation system like in these photos, but I do think you need to have like a plan to get your plants water. So if you're going to be planting them somewhere where you know you're not going to be able to get water to them, either your hose is not going to be long enough or you just don't have water in that location, um, you're gonna the yield for these plants and then also just the plants themselves, getting them established is going to be tough. So the other thing you want to make sure about in your planting site is that you're going to get at least 6 hours of sun. This is even more important for blackberries, I think, than raspberries. Uh, I am in the part of the state, so I'm in Wycomico County in Salisbury, and we are zone 7B by the USDA rating system. If you are in Western Maryland or somewhere further north, like Pennsylvania, I would recommend that you plant your raspberries in full sun. In areas like mine, where we get a lot of summer heat and high humidity and strong sun, raspberries actually can tolerate a little bit less full sun, or they can be grown under a shade cloth. And I'll talk a little bit more about why they're so sensitive in more southern, higher heat regions, whereas blackberries are a little bit more are going to hold up to that more, and they definitely want full sun. So. I see this in the questions just right now. So when I'm talking about irrigation, the best thing to do would be to set up a line like one of these. These are drip irrigation, or you could set up a soaker hose. The other option is just to hand water. I mean, you can go out with a hose and make sure you water, but when it starts to get hot and dry, you definitely want to be watering these plants, especially in the first year when they're getting established. But generally, berries don't have very robust root systems. So that's why it's really important that you get them irrigation water if it's hot and dry, because they're not going to hold up very well if they don't get water, 3 times a week if it's not raining and it's hot and dry. Okay, so the types of plants you can purchase. I really like working with plugs. I think that they're the easiest. Certainly, you can buy a potted plant, like a bigger plant, but those are going to be a lot more expensive. So my recommendation, if you're going to put in like a whole row of blackberries or raspberries, are to buy these plugs here that you see a fresh tray. You can, if they're a small plant, they're usually pretty affordable. Another method of plants that you can buy that you only want to plant, really the best time to plant bare roots plants is in the spring and early spring, so in March. This is an example of what bare roots plants look like. They're essentially a cane with all of the roots, but it's been dehydrated. So when you plant a bare roots plant, you're gonna put it into the hole where you're planting it, and then you're gonna give it a lot of water. Actually, a lot of times on the directions they say to soak it first, because that is going to bring the plant basically out of hibernation, where it was all dry and tell it, okay, it's time to start growing again. The other type of plants, these are more, I think, the type that more commercial growers would use, but sometimes you may find these, like a nursery selling them, would be tips or tip layer canes. And that's kind of like this example B here on the right hand side of the screen, where you have a cane, an old cane, and then there's basically a new sucker coming out. If you have a friend with a whole bunch of blackberries or raspberries, you can dig up these new suckers that are attached to old canes and plant them. Another thing that's very important for the health and longevity of your planting is to make sure that you keep the planting pruned. So essentially, because we talked about the biannual cane cycle, after that second year, when the plants have produced fruit, you can get rid of them. So you usually want to wait until the winter, or at least until temperatures are starting to get below freezing. And the reason for that is because when you prune, you're opening up a wound in that plant. So you can imagine, I mean, when we open up wounds in our skin, there are possibilities for infection. So when you do this in the winter, um, most of the pathogens that are going to be affecting plants are not active. They can't survive in freezing temperatures. So that's the reason why we recommend doing all of this hard pruning in the winter so as not to spread disease. And you always want to use clean tools and things like that. But generally, you do your pruning in the winter, and then the other type of pruning you would be doing at that time would be if you have any long canes. So this is kind of what a lot of the black raspberries end up growing like. They end up having these very long trailing vining canes, and some blackberries do this as well. You would also prune those so that they don't hang on the ground, because in the following year, A, you don't want that fruit developing on the ground, but B, that will also weight the plant down too much, and it will make it structurally unsound, basically. So you want to prune them like this in the winter. Okay, tipping. Tipping is sort of the soft tissue pruning that you do in the summer. Um, this is fairly important for both blackberries and raspberries. I would say it's more important for blackberries because they tend to be a little bit more vigorous. Um, and all you're doing when you're tipping is you're taking the soft, new green tissue that hasn't gotten woody yet, and you're pruning off the top 2 to 4 inches. And you only do this when the blackberry or raspberry has reached above the trellis, or basically when it has reached a height at which you would no longer want to pick it. So for me, that would be anything above my shoulders. I don't want my plant getting taller than my shoulders because I'm going to have a hard time picking it. And the reason why we do tipping is when you take off that tip that's growing upwards, or it's growing apically, we would say, is the botanical term, that is going to encourage lateral growth. So it's going to tell the plant, hey, I need to grow horizontally. And that will result in there being basically more branching, and more branching equals more fruiting the next year. So you're going to tip the primocanes or the first year canes. It's going to help with the height. It's going to lateral growth, and then theoretically you should get a higher yield the second year on the floricanes. Another question people tend to have about blackberries and raspberries: do they require pollination or cross-pollination? So just a reminder, blueberries do require cross-pollination, but strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries only require pollination. So that means you do need a bee to visit, but you don't need more than one variety. So if you have a very limited amount of space, you can put in one blackberry bush or one raspberry cane, and it will produce fruit as long as you let bees get to the flowers. The soil requirements for blackberries and raspberries are basically you want to have relatively high organic matter in your soils. 2% is kind of the minimum. Of course, we always recommend you do a soil test, but some of this you can sort of tell by looking at your soil. Like, for instance, where I live, my soil looks like sand. It is this color. It is kind of this grayish color. It is not black and loamy. And blackberry plants like this black loamy. The blackness in the soil usually means you have organic matter. It means you have carbon there, and that's what berries grow really well in. They grow really well in loose soil. So if your soil is high organic matter, but it's a lot of clay and it's really hard, the roots don't grow very well in that. So you can amend it with things like wood chips, peat moss, compost. All of those more lightweight materials are going to be much better for blackberries and raspberry roots to grow in. Plus, most of these have high water holding capacities, which are good for keeping that water in there in the summer heat. So, yeah, you want this well-draining sandy loam soil ideally. So, the other thing, if you know anything about blueberries, you know that they need low pHs. Blackberries and raspberries need a normal pH, basically, or a similar pH to most of your other garden vegetables. So really, I think 5.8 is a little low. I would want to see at least 6 to 7 pH. So. And as far as fertilizing and nutrition for these plants, you are going to fertilize them generally in the spring when the buds begin to break. So, right about now would be a good time to fertilize. And in general, for a first year planting, you're going to apply less fertilizer because you don't want to burn the plants. So, if I had just planted in March, I would only apply 2 pounds of something like a 10-10-10 fertilizer per 100 linear foot row. And I'm going to kind of scatter it within the row up to about a foot on either side of the plant. Not so much in the first year, but as they start to get bigger. And then for the following years, once the planting is established, I want to apply at least 5 pounds of something like a 10-10-10. It can be, the fertilizer can be higher in nitrogen. That is the nutrient that plants need the most of. So if you have like a 20, 5, 10, that'll still work just fine as a fertilizer. The other thing you can do is add things like compost or other organic, slow forms of nutrients. Compost, because it has so much carbon in it, will hold on to nutrients and kind of slowly release them over time. Plus, it helps to build your soil. It's good for introducing new microorganisms. So that's another thing you can add to add a little bit of nutrients, but it's a little bit harder with compost to know how many nutrients you're getting. So I would still recommend using some kind of supplemental fertilizer. So now I'm going to specifically talk about blackberries and some of their quirks and what I like about them. So a little bit about blackberry architecture. Wild blackberries that you may see in forests or on the side of the road, most of them are kind of have this vining architecture. They'll crawl up onto other plants. They're super thorny, but a lot of the new varieties of blackberries, if you're looking in a catalog, um, at their descriptions, you may see upright or erect architecture. That just means they have these much stronger, stiffer canes now, um, and they hold themselves up a little bit better. Another thing I really like about the new architecture of blackberries is many of the new varieties are thornless. And if you've ever harvested blackberries before out in the wild, you know how brutal the thorns are. I think blackberry thorns are way worse than raspberry thorns. I mean, I don't like any thorns, but blackberries will cut you up. So I really only recommend that people plant the thornless varieties. So trellising, now, even though I just told you there are some new upright varieties of blackberries, they still all, if you're gonna have a big planting of them, you really should have a trellis for them. And there are a bunch of different trellis systems. This one, this picture, I wish this was in better clarity. This is from a farm that I have where I work with a farmer, but you can use something like a T-post is what he's used here, and wire to build a trellis system. And the reason why you kind of need a trellis or some sort of structural support for a blackberry is because once they start putting on that fruit load, when you have a big bushy plant, that fruit load is heavy and they will fall over. Or they can split the cane if the fruit load is too great. So these are kind of trellis designs that you can use, uh, different ways to build them if you really want to get into it. V trellises and T trellises are the best kind of trellises. There's another type called I trellises, and those are just straight instead of the V shape. But this V shape allows for more sunlight to penetrate the lower parts of the canopy, and so you'll get a higher yield if you're really into maximizing your production. So other reasons why you would trellis is if you have one of these cultivars that's more of a vining type, or they're called trailing, they need to be tied up. So they're going to behave more like true vines. And so this is called training them, when you put them on the trellis the way you want them to grow. So that's what they do with grapes. You do the same with these vining or trailing varieties of blackberries. This picture here is just showing you how to actually attach the blackberry to your trellis. So if you have wires on a trellis, or even if you were putting them along a chain link fence, you need to attach them somehow. So you can use something like a twist tie. I have a million twist ties in my house, so I do use these. Or if you want to go a little bit more professional, you could use some of these like plastic clips, or maybe even zip ties. If you had a bunch of zip ties, would also work. But if you don't clip them somehow to the trellis, they're just going to fall off. They don't develop tendrils the way that like a cucumber or a pea. Here is an example from my house. I don't have a trellis here where I'm growing my blackberries. I decided to use something to make it more garden beautifying. So I've just woven these blackberries around an arbor, and that works just as well as a trellis. So you can use all sorts of different methods, but blackberries are just going to require some kind of structural support. So some of the pests that you're going to encounter if you're growing blackberries, and this one is true for raspberries as well. We have a fairly new insect that has come to the US and the East Coast specifically, called spotted wing Drosophila. It is just a non-native fruit fly, but it is everywhere, and it's really hard to deal with. You would have to spray a lot of pesticides to deal with it. So just be aware it's out there. This is also part of the reason I don't really like to grow the primocane fruiting varieties that make fruit in the fall, because the populations of this pest go up exponentially throughout the summer. So I like the early fruit varieties because I know there probably aren't so many maggots. And when you start to see fruit flies, in the house or around, that's when you know that they're probably going to be laying eggs in your fruit. Another pest that I have seen be a nuisance on blackberries is called strawberry clipper weevil. And true to its name, it can sort of clip off the buds of a blackberry. So if you see that the flower bud has sort of just broken here, that could be caused by the strawberry clipper weevil. It is very small. It might be hard for you to see. The other damage that it inflicts is it uses its nose or its sucking mouthpiece to damage the flower bud. So you might have all these flowers and be wondering, why am I not getting any fruit? It could be because of this pest. Another pest that I have seen on people's blackberries around here is the redneck cane borer. Um, it looks like this, but it's hard to actually spot the insect. What you're more likely to see is the damage that it causes. So it'll make the cane bulge. And so if you see kind of this fat portion of the cane, it may spread along the cane. That is the larvae of this insect that are inside of the cane and are chewing through it. And so you can just cut that piece out. Um, so you can prune it away to get rid of them. But unless you want to spray insecticides or something like that, these are just things to look out for, but there isn't that much you can do about them. This said, I have blackberries at home. I don't see that many of these pests, but these are the ones that I have seen in other people's plantings. I think another thing that can help is having a garden area where you're attracting a lot of beneficial insects. Okay. The other big problem, disease problem, I think the biggest disease problem that some growers have with blackberries is leaf rust. It's this orange fungal pathogen. The spores are orange, I should say. This is what it looks like on the underside of a blackberry leaf. And the variety that gets it the worst is called Navajo. It's an older variety. So my recommendation to avoid this, because it will slowly kill the plant, is not to plant that variety. Um, you can look on the description of any variety that you're thinking about planting and just check to see that I don't think there's any true resistance to orange leaf rust, but some varieties get it worse than others. And so I would think, especially some of the newer varieties of blackberries, they're probably breeding for some level of resistance to this disease. Okay, so in talking about the cultivars, most of the new cultivars have this kind of more erect, sometimes they're called semi-erect or erect architecture, and most of them are being bred in places like Arkansas, North Carolina, and Oregon. You can imagine that the varieties that do the best in Maryland are the ones that are bred in places that are the most similar to Maryland. And even though Arkansas doesn't seem a lot like Maryland, and it is pretty similar in terms of the climate. So the Arkansas varieties do tend to do well here. Some of the North Carolina varieties, those do well here. And then I'm testing out some Oregon varieties. We're going to see if they can hold up to the Maryland heat. And then there are some new primocane fruiting varieties of blackberries. I don't grow these because I don't like that fall fruit. I think there are too many pests out there in the fall. The other thing is that you don't really get big yields in the second year on the floricanes. If you have a big primocane yield, and then this SWD, that is the spotted winged Drosophila, it's more of a problem in the fall. So I don't particularly love them, but if you want to have fall fruit, you can plant some of these. These are some of the thornless cultivars, or most of the thornless cultivars. The ones that I have in purple, these have been bred to have either improved aroma or flavor, and they're supposed to be much sweeter than some blackberries. I know I love blueberries are my favorite fruit. I think blackberries are a little bit more tart and sometimes don't have as much flavor, but some of these new varieties are much better, in my opinion, as a blueberry lover. And then the varieties that we have in green over here, these are the ones that make primocane or first year cane fruit. So they all conveniently are named Primark. So if you see Primark that they'll fruit on the primocanes. Okay, so here's just kind of a chart. This is one I made, and these are basically the expected harvest fruit window for the thornless varieties that we recommend. So if you want to have fruit from mid-June until the end of August, you can sort of strategically pick maybe 3 different cultivars, and put them into your planting, so that you have fruit, for a longer season. Whereas if you only plant Ponca, you're only going to have fruit until maybe mid-July. But if you follow that with Celestial and Triple Crown, you could have fruit in a much longer window. And then you can also have these primocane fruiting varieties if you want to eat fruit into the fall. So that's one way to stagger and make sure you get fruit all summer. Just so you all know, a lot of these varieties haven't been tested officially by the university, but I am growing them in 3 different sites in Maryland. So one is in Keedysville, so that's in Western Maryland. One is at the Y Research Center near Queenstown on the Eastern Shore, and then one is right by me in Salisbury. And hopefully we'll have some results and we'll know how well these varieties do, so I can give people a better idea what makes sense to grow here in Maryland. Oh, this is some older data from a previous cultivar trial in Maryland. All I really want to highlight here is that the varieties Osage, Ouachita, and Vaughn did very well in the variety trial, whereas Arapahoe, Freedom, and Natchez did not do quite as well for us in this older variety trial. Okay, so moving on to raspberries. Um, I thought this picture is really cool because it shows all the color differences. So I want to start this by saying that if you live on Delmarva, uh, this really isn't the right climate to be at least commercially producing raspberries. You're going to run into problems with the high heat, and the amount of sunlight we get. Raspberries are more delicate than blueberries or blackberries, and they have the shortest shelf life. And there just aren't a lot of new varieties that are being bred for heat tolerance. Now, that said, if you're in northern Maryland or western Maryland, Pennsylvania, or Jersey or New York, these are some of the areas where people, at least farmers, tend to grow raspberries. But you can grow raspberries here, and I do grow raspberries. I just have to deal with a lot of this. So, okay, growing raspberries is very similar to growing blackberries. They also should be grown with some structural support or a trellis. I like to grow them along a fence line. I have a picket fence that I grow them against, and you can just use wires to keep them in that area and prop them up. It's the same reason why blackberries need a trellis, is just they have a high fruit load when they're during harvest season, and they'll fall over otherwise. And they don't get quite as tall as blackberries, so some varieties you need to tip, other varieties I find that, if they don't get tall enough, I don't tip them. Okay, so these are some of the varieties that we recommend. Uh, some of these are the red or the gold raspberry varieties, and I have in here some of the primocane fruiting ones. I will say that I personally grow double gold, and I really like it. It is a little bit harder with the gold varieties to tell when they're ripe, but usually I can tell when I pull, if it wants to come off of the cone, then it's ready, it's ripe, and they turn a little bit pinkish. I've never grown Anne, but I hear it's a good variety. I just I figured one pinkish variety was enough for my yard. Yeah, some of these other varieties, I've grown Joan Jay. It's all right. It's mostly thornless, but once in a while it'll have a few thorns. I think I have Caroline, and it's all right. Some of these varieties have better flavor. Some of them are going to be more early. It just kind of depends what you're looking for in terms of which ones are going to make sense for you to plant. Now, as far as the black and the purple varieties of raspberries, so the purple varieties are a cross between red raspberries and black raspberries. All I know about the purple raspberries, because I don't grow them, is that royalty is very productive. And but everybody I know who has ever tasted it says it doesn't taste good. I think I should warn you, even though they look very beautiful, I've never met anybody who really enjoys eating the purple varieties. Now, that's not true about the black varieties. Some people really like the black raspberries. I personally think red raspberries have more flavor, but some people really like the black. So um, these are some of the varieties that are good choices for Maryland if you're interested in growing black raspberries. They do tend to yield a little bit less than red raspberries, I will say. Okay, so these are some of the mostly red raspberries, but a few of the black raspberries. This is their harvest window or their season. So the earliest are going to be things like Jewel and Niwot. At the end of the season, you're going to have some of these purple varieties. There are probably, I feel like there are more raspberry varieties on the market than there are blackberries, or at least thornless blackberries. So you have a lot more choices. Here are some of the primocane harvestable varieties. Some of these are making fruit as early as August, and this is also in Massachusetts, so they're a little bit earlier here in Maryland. Um, that said, I wouldn't be messing around with the varieties that are um, like I grow double gold, but I grow it for the floricane fruit. So I like that second season spring fruit better than I like the fall fruit, because I just know that it doesn't have quite so many spotted wing Drosophila in it. And one thing I think that is really cool about raspberries is just this color variation. So I really like to see what color they're going to be before planting them, because the colors are really cool. So this is an example of some of those fruit colors. Because even though it's a red raspberry, I mean, some of these are more like pinkish red, and some of them are really a dark, deep red. The biggest pest problem I have on the raspberries is definitely Japanese beetle. They will affect the fruit and they'll make it, I don't want to eat fruit that a Japanese beetle has been on. It, yeah, yeah, it's kind of gross. They will also make holes in the leaves, so they will eat the leaves. There are things like Japanese beetle traps, but they tend to attract even more Japanese beetles, so I don't recommend that you put up a Japanese beetle trap. You can spray things like neem oil to try to deal with them. But the thing about neem oil, I would definitely wash your fruit if you're going to spray it because it has this like garlicky, um, kind of icky flavor. You could try spraying them with insecticidal soap too. But yeah, they're going to be a problem. The other big problem I have on the Eastern Shore is that the days that we have that are over 90 degrees tend to damage um, the fruit, so you start to get what's called sun scald. It looks like a sunburn. The fruit gets all white where the sun has been hitting it. The damage is not harmful to human health, so I will still eat a sun scalded berry, but I know that it's not going to taste quite as good, and like the flesh isn't quite as nice as, a normal berry, but for home consumption, they're fine. And then the biggest disease problem that I see in raspberries is usually a fungal pathogen called cane blight, and it can start when the plants have been wounded. So this is another reason if you're doing any tipping, you want to be really careful about using a clean clipper and maybe dunking it in a bleach solution in between cuts to make sure that whenever you wound a plant, that you're not allowing pathogens to get into that wound or spreading pathogens from plant to plant. Okay, the other thing about this disease is it's very common in black raspberries. It's my understanding that black raspberries are just a little bit harder to produce than red raspberries, but I don't personally grow them. I just hear growers talk about them. They just seem like they're a little bit more finicky. Lastly, I'll just go over a couple of resources or things I would use if I was trying to learn more. There is a North American, I think, Raspberries and Blackberries Association is what NARBA stands for, something like that. And this is really usually for commercial growers, but they have a lot of good information on their website. Another thing I found on their website and also have kind of created is where to get plants, like a nursery list. So if I were you, I would expect to pay between $5 and $20 per raspberry plant or blackberry plant. I would shop around, and I have historically ordered my plants because then I can get exactly what I want. I do not want to buy the discount plant at Walmart where nobody knows anything about it. It could be diseased, and it might not even be like the right variety for this climate. So, I would recommend ordering from a nursery, and also usually you can call them and get support if you have questions about something. So here are some of the nurseries that sell either blackberries or um, blackberries and raspberries. So yep, back to the NARBA website. They have this list on there of blackberry and raspberry nurseries that you can go look up. Some of these are meant for like commercial growers, so you need like a minimum order. I would say this list right here, these are more nurseries that sell to like home growers. All right, so other resources that could be helpful. We have a whole home and garden information center that you've probably heard us talk about. You can find that on our Maryland Extension website, but it's probably easier to just type it into Google, like Maryland Home and Garden Information Center, Blackberry Raspberry. There's a very long link to it at the bottom of the screen, which I could put in the chat later if you want to go through here. This is a very manageable sized article. It's not too long. But if you want to specifically learn about how to start growing blackberries at home. I have a new fact sheet that's out. This is only 4 pages, and it'll explain all about how to get everything ready for blackberry production. Uh, if you are also thinking about going and planting a lot of blackberries and raspberries, and you really want to know more, there's a free guide called the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide, that has much more information than what I went over, in this talk, and you can download that for free, from the Rutgers website. I think you might be able to get it on our website, but this is the link I always use. And then if you were growing commercially, I recommend people use the Southern States Caneberry Spray Guide, because that is actually a better, I think, reference than the Northeast for Maryland. So, with that, I will take any questions or comments that people have. I have a blackberry shrub that I planted in 2022. It isn't doing well, possibly too dry or not irrigated when I planted. I believe it's also getting too much sun. Is it too late to move it? It has green stems. Oh, okay. So one reason why a blackberry plant might not be doing very well is if it is not in full sun. I'm wondering where you would plan to move it. It is a little bit late to be moving, especially a sensitive plant, already this year because it's about to get hot, especially where I'm at. Maybe if you're in a slightly cooler zone, like if you're out in Garrett County or Allegheny, I would say go for it. But it is a little bit late. If it's growing somewhere that is not full sun, then I would say, yeah, you probably do want to move it. If you choose to move it, make sure to baby it, basically. So make sure that, it has proper water. Don't fertilize it right away. Whenever you move a plant, wait at least 2 weeks before you give it any nutrients because it's already having a shock to its system when it gets moved. And a lot of times when you apply fertilizer, that's also a shock, and sometimes it's in too high of a concentration and it can burn the plant. Um, so I would say if you are going to move it, just make sure you check on it every day and kind of baby it along, basically this season. And wherever you move it to, amend that soil with what it likes. So wood chips or compost and those high organic matter type growing medias will be helpful too. I see another question. Any tips for someone who doesn't have full sun? My tips would be to grow raspberries because as long as you have partial sun, I'm going to say at least 4 to 6 hours a day, you can do raspberries. Blackberries aren't going to do nearly as well, but the raspberries really will tolerate that. I mean, if you think about it, you do tend to see raspberries growing under trees in the forest. So you might not get as high of a yield, but my advice would be raspberries. Now, if you're in complete shade, I would say try something else because total shade, you're not going to have a very productive um, planting if they don't get any direct sun. And then I see another question. Let's see. So would you say growing in containers using mostly compost, and refilling the compost yearly would make them happy? So if you're growing in containers, I would the soil you put in the first year is going to be what you would stick with because this is a perennial planting. So if I was growing in containers, I would use a very lightweight soil media, and I might even incorporate some perlite, which are those little white rocks that kind of look like styrofoam when you buy potting mix, because those really help to allow air spaces or pore spaces for water drainage. The most important thing in containers is that You have kind of a lightweight growing media. Instead of changing that soil out every year because you don't want to be disturbing the roots, I would just be making sure you definitely give that system fertilizer because um, the only access to nutrients that plant has are in that container. So every year you really got to be fertilizing. But yeah, just make sure you get good growing media in that container to start with. All right, I see another question about blueberries. I have a blueberry. Oh, that was a blueberry shrub. Oh, that was planted in the fall of 20. Okay. Um, ugh. So I didn't really go over blueberries in this talk. I would not be moving a blueberry at this time of the year. Um, if you're having problems with blueberries, it is likely because of the soil pH. That is the most common problem people have. Um, get a soil test done because blueberries will not grow and they will slowly die if the soil pH is above 5.5. They really like their soil pH to be between 4.5 and 5.2. So that's not what most soil is. Most soil is going to be at higher pHs. Most gardening soil is going to be at higher pHs. So in order to get soil to that pH level, you usually have to add something like sulfur. You can also add things like pine needles, but sulfur is going to lower your soil pH more effectively than anything else. That is why people find it so challenging to grow blueberries. That and they want a very specific soil media. They're kind of like blackberries and raspberries. They want that soft, easy to move through high organic matter soil, but they also need it to be well draining and they need it to be, in this very certain pH range. So, yes, they grow very well in the woods all over the US, but they tend not to grow very well in people's yards unless they have been babied along. Okay, sorry, I just missed that earlier when I saw the question. If we plant now, will we get fruit next summer? Yes, you can plant blackberries and raspberries now. I would say if you are going to plant now, do it as soon as possible and baby them along for the first month because it's about to get hot and really you kind of want to plant a little bit earlier than this. Um, that said, you can get them in the ground. If you plant a primocane fruiting variety, you may even get a little bit of fruit this year, but you're going to get more fruit next year. And then really in year 3 is going to be you're going to be in your full season. You should be getting that like 10 to 20 pounds per bush or per plant. Beetles love borage. Strategically planted. Okay, so that could be used as a trap crop. I grow borage in my herb garden, but it is very close to my it's very close to my raspberries, so maybe that's also attracting them. Are grubs in the lawn the source of the area of Japanese beetle? Okay to use milky spore in that area to suppress the beetles next year. Oh man, I don't know. I've never used anything to try to kill the Japanese beetles. I know that they are a ground larvae, and that would be a good way to suppress them. But if they're coming from outside of your yard, and because they can fly, I think they have a pretty wide range. If you want to address them in your yard, I would say yes, go for a product that says it can kill them. I haven't used it though, so I can't really vouch for it. And I do know that, I mean, they have a pretty wide range of an area that they can cover. So if there's something else, if there's some other area where they're being bred outside of your yard, they may still come to your yard. Is organic berry tone a good fertilizer for my blackberries and raspberries? So I haven't used organic berry tone, but I would guess that because it's organic, it's going to be a more slow release form of nutrients. What I would check on there, if I were you, is the numbers. So the numbers associated with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to get an idea kind of how much to use. So when I talked about the 10-10-10, that means 10% of the weight of the fertilizer is each of those nutrients. And a lot of times the organic fertilizers have lower amounts of nitrogen, which is the most important um, element for plant growth. So I would just make sure that you're giving them enough nitrogen uh, so that they do well. A good rule of thumb to figure out if your plants are nutrient deficient or if they're doing well is how dark green the leaves are. So if you start to notice that the leaves are not as green as they were, or they're starting to get yellow, that should imply to you that they don't have enough nitrogen, or sometimes it's another nutrient, but usually it's nitrogen, and then you need to fertilize. Okay. What size containers or grow bags would you suggest? I would suggest at least a 5-gallon bucket. And when it comes to containers, I would go for ones that are wider rather than taller. So I wouldn't want one that is really tall and skinny, like what trees grow in, because berries don't have very deep root systems, unlike trees. So I would try and get one with more of a like wide mouth. But like a 5-gallon container should be okay. And over time, like you'll have to prune it because new suckers will come up all over the container um, as it keeps growing. And I would probably not use a grow bag because grow bags, I don't think they would hold up over time. I don't think they would hold up for 20 years. Maybe they would, but I would want to use like a harder shell pot. Okay. How about growing them from seed? I would not do that because both blackberries and raspberries are not true to type. So that means every single blackberry seed and every raspberry seed, if you plant them, they're going to be very different from their parents in the way that children are very different from our parents. So you may likely you're going to get a plant that is not going to be as good as a commercial variety. So it may be like a fun experiment, but if you want to grow something for your own home consumption that you know is going to be tasty and have good fruit quality and maybe not have thorns, I would definitely buy that from a nursery or just get plugs or sorry, the stem, get a cane, a couple of canes from a friend or new suckers that has them in their yard. We live in Howard County. Where can we get our soil tested? So most of the soil testing facilities that we use around the state are you mail in a sample. So you would take between 10 to 15 samples in your garden area with like a garden trowel down to like 6 inches or so, and then mix them all together and baggy up about a cup of that. And then you would send it with a to one of the soil sampling companies. We have like a whole web page about soil sampling and then different labs that you can use. So thank you all for attending. We really appreciate you coming to this series, and our last and final series or webinar will be in 2 weeks, and that will be on tomatoes, and I think we'll cover some heirloom tomato varieties because 2 weeks from now is really about the time when you should be putting tomatoes out in the garden. So yeah, hope to see you all at the last webinar of our series this year. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.